In the words of Alain Jouffroy, Diya Azzawi, A Positive Modernity. It is a strange story. I only speak a few words of Arabic and have never learned the language, although I have traveled widely in Arab countries and have visited Yemen, Lebanon, Egypt, and Morocco, for example, several times. But, and I cannot emphasize this too strongly, I often feel more comfortable and more in harmony with Arab painters or writers than I do in the studio or workroom of a European painter or writer, even in Paris. Why? Is it because of a special sympathy for Arabs in general, their culture and history pre- and post-Islam, and for the discrimination they suffer so often and so perversively? I do not think it is, or if so, only up to a point. There are Arab painters, sculptors, writers, and poets with whom I have no common ground, of course through my fault as well as theirs. But this is not the case with the Iraqi painter Diya Azzawi, whom I met recently. When I stepped into his big studio in outer London, the place of exile where he has made his own imaginary Baghdad, and saw his paintings, gouaches, drawings and sculptures, something immediately happened, something very like the birth of true understanding, part of the pleasure of a friendship being born. But although I number other Iraqi exiles among my friends, for example the poet Shawqi Abdul Amir, I have never been to Iraq and have no plans to go there. So Iraq as a country, or even as an ancestral tradition, could not have provided the immediate link between us as we talked and listened to each other in mutual understanding. What took place was agreement between two different but equally open-minded individuals. But as I write this introduction to his retrospective exhibition at the Institut du Monde Arabe de Paris in 2001, I suffer nevertheless from a major disadvantage. I have never seen the palm groves, the cities, or the unique monuments of the country between the Tigris and the Euphrates, the place where writing, the real source of the whole of Western civilization, was born. So I write without knowledge of Diya Azzawi's physical, territorial background. But paradoxically, rather than inducing paralysis, this absence of concrete knowledge has forced me to invent another way of seeing and assessing things, starting, of course, with his painting. Diya Azzawi was born in Baghdad in 1939. He attended the Faculty of Arts, studied archaeology, and from 1962 took a course at the School of Fine Art in modern Western painting techniques. From the start, a fascination with the arts of Mesopotamian civilization, combined with his knowledge of modernity, guided and disoriented the utterly independent intellectual and artistic line he has followed until the present day. Azzawi worked for 7 years at the Iraqi Museum of Archaeological Excavation, where he was in charge of organizing new museums. In line with his training as a colorist by his teacher Fa'iq Hassan and his long-standing fascination with the Iraqi painter and sculptor Jawad Salim, whom Iraqis regard as the pioneer of the artistic renaissance of the 1930s, he followed a double track, which he saw as a single one. And Jawad Salim, the modernist painter and sculptor, encouraged him from a very early stage to combine the influence of Western techniques with his Sumerian, Assyrian, and Babylonian heritage, and with Arabic calligraphy. This was excellent advice from a true master to an excellent disciple. Azzawi was politically committed, but also attended a Quranic school. He says that he has used the Quran to improve his understanding of society in many ways. This has not made him a religious fanatic, however. Under the influence of a group of artists who defined themselves as Impressionists, Jama'at al-Intiba'iyyin, who regarded the subject of a painting, in this case landscape, as more important than the aesthetic adopted. He was inspired first by ancient statues and cylindrical seals, but Azzawi, who now concentrated on Arabic literary and historical subjects, soon became passionately interested in esoteric symbols, folklore, manuscripts, and above all, calligraphy. Thus, his first themes included the 1001 Nights, the legend of Gilgamesh, and the martyr Hussein. His first one-man exhibition was in Baghdad in 1965 and was followed by exhibitions in Beirut, Tripoli, Kuwait, Cairo, Bahrain, and India. His first one-man exhibition was in Baghdad in 1965 and was followed by exhibitions in Beirut, Tripoli, Kuwait, Cairo, Bahrain, and India. He became associated with the Iraqi group Towards a New Vision, نحو الرؤية الجديدة, whose manifesto he signed in 1969 with Hashim al-Samarji and Muhriddin. Now politically radicalized, Azzawi began to pour emotion into depictions of the Palestinian and Kurdish questions, using posters as his medium so as to be able to communicate his message to the maximum number of people, as well as using painting, drawing, silk screen printing, and engraving. From what I learned about his pictures in London, where he came to live during the 1970s, I understood that his oeuvre, which was already immense, drew on his early artistic and political experiences, and that any attempt to separate one from the other would result in serious misunderstanding of his work. I was delighted to perceive a new way of seeing in the relationship, still little understood in Europe, between Arabic tradition and modernity, one which should help Eastern as well as Western visitors to the exhibition to find their way towards a new, truly global and not globalist conception of relationships between the very different individuals in the world who think, or like to think, of themselves as increasingly isolated, but who, whatever their perceptions and whatever their misfortunes, never can be so. Interconnected as they all are, and were long before the internet, if they really wanted to, they could invent a new definition of what we call humanity. As I have said before, and explained using the examples of Japan and Korea, I long ago ceased to believe in the traditional, old-fashioned, if not completely obsolete, opposition between East and West, as envisaged, experienced, and handed down for centuries. True artists, poets, and painters from both sides of the rising sun overcame this opposition during the 1930s and completely mastered it, though in an unexpected way after the Second World War. The opposition is sure to change its nature at the end of the Third World War, which is now taking place in Europe as elsewhere without our being aware of it, and which pits religions, nationalities, and tribes against one another in a succession of increasingly tragic and criminal conflicts. Dia Azzawi has long been aware of this New World tragedy. I cannot remember who called him the Picasso of the Arab world, but he has, in his own way, done the same thing as Picasso, who introduced African art and Iberian art into modern Western art to give it more weight and more universal force. Azzawi has done what Matisse did in Morocco, but the other way around. With no concession whatsoever to commercial taste or fashion, and no collusion with the spectacular folklore of the East, Dia Azzawi achieved an extremely original and persuasive symbiosis of Sumerian architectonics. temples and ziggurats, with the dynamic of modernity as it has appeared and diversified in the developed world. To my knowledge, he is the only Arab painter to have accomplished this feat with such ease and mastery, and of his own free will, for no one, no gallery or official institution ever asked him to do it, as to astound the viewer. Looking at the paintings, whatever their size, and at the drawings, engravings, silkscreen prints, and sculptures, Diya uses all these forms, the viewer is struck by the energy created by all the intuitions and deciphered experiences, both internal and external, that make up this display. This energy is clearly present in the reinvention of archaic forms almost 5,000 years old, in the use of colors, both clashing and matching, to create the effect of a huge fire, in the music of their war and peace, all their chromatic orchestrations, and finally their deep-toned song, their cantibondo, as the Andalusians call it. The vast scope of this creation sometimes seems like a 2- and 3-dimensional symphony in painting and sculpture. The overwhelming impression is of power presented head-on. Before a large painting like The Years of the Slaughter of Palestinians, done in 1976, for example, you feel you are seeing a ruined fortress or a great wall that has collapsed. The effect is created partly by the magnificent distribution of colors, but it is the construction of his pictures that evokes this architectural metaphor, often making them look like doors, or their lintels, or like windows. This is expressed in the titles themselves. Window, 1986, A Window in Tangier, number 1 and 2, 1996, and The Splendid Book of Door, 1994. But these paintings also contain a great many standing figures, which look like monuments. For example, Abdullah leaving his city number 2, done in 1980.